All right, let's see here. Okay, why don't we start? And I mean, it looks like most of the people here are from the class, so I'll just make sure that we have a sense of the landscape today. So the first part of class will be having these talks from our two guests. We will be having a question and answer afterwards, and then we'll take our dinner break and then come back and do the critiques. We might end early today if we don't go the full time, but we'll see how things go. And for those, and I don't think there's anybody, I think this is pretty much all the class, so I don't have to actually contextualize what we're doing in class. You know what we're doing and why this might apply. But one of the things to remind you is that both Colin and Henry are here to provide some various approaches to internet writing that we're doing right now. But I think there's also some sort of sensibility that both of them have that will blend in to the Gothic units that we'll be doing starting next week. Colin is we haven't really talked about who's going first, but I think it would make more sense for Colin to go first and then Henry. And I'll introduce both of them now. Colin, I feel like is a mysterious presence on Instagram, but I feel like I got a sense of you, right? And I think that's why I was interested in inviting you, because there was something about, I think one of the purposes of style itself is to give us a sense of the person, a kind of existential signature. So despite Colin's playing with anonymity and presence, you got a strong sense of his work, of what that stylistic signature was. Even though he's doing various things, they all seem to come together. And I would say that, Colin, at least in your Instagram work, you use the full potential of Instagram as an expanded poetic space. And there's a variety of asemic, gritty, cursed, found. Right? These are all things we've been talking about, right? There is sometimes the Gothic and the weird. There's the vernacular and the everyday. All of these in a, let's just say, very interesting intervention into the way in which we think about image and text art. Henry is somebody I've followed for a while now, and always, I just watched your new one about the little church, and there's always something that gives me that's a little moving. There's a little moving moment at the end. I was almost cried. I've cried many times during YouTube, Henry's YouTube videos. They're fun, but they're also have a heart of gold. And I was, if you haven't taken a look at his work, he barnstorms through archives and historical society minutiae, finding traces of long forgotten stories on the American landscape. And one of the things I was talking about with Henry at one point is that, we've gotten into this point in time where people take advantage of the long form of the YouTube essay or the podcast, and they kind of just like, some of that is just boring and self-indulgent, right? People will take 3 hours and it will be just like chatting with their buddies, and there's no sense of, sort of what can this particular medium do. And I think that Henry is a great example of somebody who uses the full potential of the video essay to bring together, the research. There's a performance aspect to it. There's a humor. There's the dramatic aspect, as I was saying, also the emotional aspect. To dramatize what video can do for certain types of non-fictional inquiry. I'll also mention that amazing roller skating one. Oh my God. I mean, I don't even know how to describe it, but I sort of sat down. I was like, how he's going to do this? He's going to do this whole like sort of multi-hour roller skating marathon from, maybe, 100 years ago or so. He's going to go through every single sort of contestant. How is this going to work? But it was gripping throughout. And again, emotional moments. So those are our two guests. And again, we'll just leave it at that. We'll open with Colin, and then we'll see how we're feeling. Like if we want to keep on going, if we want to have questions then or save the questions later, we'll see how it goes. So, and let me make sure I'm admitting everybody. All right, so Colin Bolton, Book of Mummy.
Okay, hello everyone. Yeah, my name is Colin, and I guess by way of intro or disclaimers, I guess all I can really say is that I have something I wrote to read, and I'm going to pair it with a looping slideshow of a few things I chose to show, images, and yeah, I wrote something because I'm too unpracticed in the art of giving presentations off the cuff. I get distracted too easily, so I figured it'd be best if I did that. So I hope it doesn't draw on too much, or if, also just to say, I guess, I studied philosophy and literary criticism in school, and I really only got into poetry, creative writing, once I left. I just kept reading and writing once I left school. Uh, and that sort of transformed into more of an interest in the visual arts. And I've since lived or moved to, I'm from North Carolina, and I moved to New York City about 3 years ago and became an art handler. So I was exposed to a lot of, I see a lot of art from day to day. So it's really forced me to process uh, that all of that visual stimuli that I take in. Um, so I just yeah, I hope what I say isn't too niche. It's really, I guess I'm not really sure what this writing is. To be honest, I was working on it a lot today, but it's the result of a lot of thinking I've been doing lately, especially since I knew I was going to give a presentation, to try to give you something concrete, at least. It's not too abstract in terms of something you can use, or something that's hopefully useful to you. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I guess in some ways it's an ars poetica, just the way I view poetry and its relation to image. Yeah, so I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Can you see? Okay. Um, yeah, it's extremely disorganized, and I was reading Anti-Oedipus today, and there's a quote. So I hope not to be a god at work, messing it all up or strangling it by organizing it too much. I do prefer sort of material in its rawest form. So in the method of thought, in thought as method, there is nothing more important than the leap. The leap is the connection to the incommensurable. And I should say some of this is, I'm quoting from things, but most of it's my own writing. But I don't always cite my sources. The leap is the connection to the incommensurable. One leaps when there is no common measure. One leaps because one is in connection with that to which there is no connection. Poems are machines made of words. Machines work best when they break down. Poems are machines that do nothing. Analogous to a series of words and ideas hanging together. A poem is words descending from the top of a page to a bottom. This is a cliche idea. Things are best when they are bad. No excellence and beauty that hath not some strangeness in the proportion. Liking things ironically, the redundant tautology of a pleonasm insofar as we understand consciousness itself as a kind of separation of subject-object. Splitting within the self, awareness itself as this gap, ironic distance, the lack that constitutes the subject, the impossibility of self-sameness. In place of the self-identical subject, we have the identity of identity and difference. The self as a filter from Duchamp, curation, assembly, bricolage from Levi-Strauss. Liking things ironically amounts to simply saying, things are there and I enjoy that. No subject is beyond interests and stereotypes. As long as it keeps that in mind, it is thinking, since thinking means questioning all realities in order to charge their authority with contingency. Thinking means stepping outside the fiction called reality. Does it mean fleeing into illusion? It means breaking with authority that relies on realities whose inconsistency remains unquestioned. How are they there, these things? They're there as I put them there, and they're there as I found them there, between art that does and does not know its name. Art as nomination, on the one hand, from Duchamp, and the ex-nominative from Dubuffet. Analogizing the art of the mature, experienced subject, the subject that has been corrupted by academic notions of learning, to see things as they are, rendering form through light and shade, apprehending raw sense data and creating an accurate correspondence with raw materials, creating an illusion of depth in 3D on a two-dimensional surface, and on the other side, the fantastical notion of a pure pre-Lapsarian subject, the irony being that this innocence is ultimately a fabrication, an artificial construction, an irony that finds another parallel in the discovery that realism is in fact one convention among many, a discovery that finds itself illustrated in an analogy presented by the word data, meaning the given, the bit of perceptual information that pretends to an objective status, thereby concealing its subjective status. The giver, i.e. the giver, the entity that extends to its givenness by means of an intention or not. If not intention, then by chance. Otherwise, intention delivered to the object retroactively by nature of its fitness relative to the whole it corresponds to. The idea of fitness resonating with the emotional experience of good design. It just feels right. The object, whether found, constructed, or composed, reaches the locus amenus of design, the pleasant place, the sweet spot of effective complexity, the balance or notan between boring simplicity and overwhelming complexity. The notion of effective complexity mirrors the notion of a point of critical intensity in a topological phase space in which a point of critical intensity is reached. Sorry, it's sort of not perfectly edited. The point in a parabolic trajectory of time at which entropy continues to exponentiate and complexity wanes. The point at which a classical sense of beauty is registered. Example given by fractals in nature, a series of beautiful breaks. Practice the line break, lines in a poem stacked on top of one another as in lines of ink, or paint stacked on top of one another on a picture plan. A process of concealing in time the process of creation itself, the process of destroying its previous states. The compulsion to break things, the self-registering itself as negativity. The recognition that it can become what it is only by being what it's not. An aesthetics of deformation and instantiation of pan-tragicism, a trace or record of activity of a restless subject-object. This restlessness being a motor of activity that coincides with a subject's boundlessness and a recognition of its own contradictory ontological structure. Registering an ontology of incompleteness. The result or product of the process of engaging with the paradox that a thing can only become what it is by being what it's not. Harmony as simply one kind of euphoric disharmony. Liking things, okay, that's the longest paragraph. It lightens up of that. Liking things ironically as saying things are good because they are bad or because they have the perfect amount of bad in them, which, as it turns out, isn't bad at all. The retroactive changing of the bad thing into the good, the corrupt experienced in the pure and innocent, the ugly recuperated by the beauty. And this can work in reverse, analogized in a broader scheme of cultural production, whereby high culture is subverted by the low, giving a new meaning to the legitimization of the illegitimate. The value of the de-skilled, elevated themes are treated in brutal fashion. Descending objects from ceilings, aha, nicely elevated themes treated in brutal fashion. Descending objects from ceilings, elegant bourgeois objects treated in indelicate matter that lacks skill, discretion, and propriety. Those images that just passed, I would say, are these Jean Tinguely's metamatics, these descending kinetic sculptures. I stumbled across that in a lobby of this corporate office in Charlotte like 3 years ago, and it changed the way I thought about poetry. I thought, kind of seems like words descending from the top of the page. So that's what that's about. So form follows failure, not function. So much depends on what you mean by failure, what you want from success, and what you imagine poems do. Insofar as a poem is successful, it fails to fail, but in failing to fail, it also succeeds at failing. That's a lose-lose scenario, which in the alchemy of poetry, we imagine as a win-win. Poems are made of words, not ideas, in a famous story between Mallarmé and Degas. Ideas are things. No ideas, but in things. But in things, I have no idea. A poem is made of ideas. Words are made of marks. Sentences are made of lines. Drawings are made of marks. Language is a particular ordering of marks so that they are repeatable. Articulation is a divisibility into minimal units. Grapheme, morpheme, phoneme, syllable, word, phrase, clause, sentence, line, paragraph, stanza. Flattening out the hierarchical movement of integration into higher or lower orders of meaning. You can compose and remain at the level of the word or phrase. Silliman's New Sentence, referencing Gertrude Stein. The chosen unit functions like a governor limiting the movement of meaning. You can choose a foundational unit of articulation and work downwards toward disarticulation, toward the inarticulate, toward the opacity of language, as in Ed Ruscha's Liquid Words, where words dissolve into things. Or you can work from the formless into form, as in John Cayley's notion of grammalepsy. The lepsis, or seizure of language, as the moment or space in which an errant mark is recuperated into a system of articulation. And this moment of grammalepsy as an emergent property, where a qualitative change gives way to a quantitative, substantive change in kind, emergentism. The point at which a walk becomes a run, a trot becomes a gallop, akin to the moment a combination of words becomes a phrase, a clause, a sentence. And likewise, where a dot becomes a line, a combination of lines becomes a letter, combinations of letters become a word, etc. A linguistic view of Kandinsky's point 9 to 10. Between picture and pictogram, where a mark makes a shape, there's a push and pull between the 2 and 3D, going from flatness to 3 dimensions and vice versa. There is a base materiality that remains formless and resists any integration into the symbolic order or representational scheme. This is alone form, and a kind of materiality that has a propensity toward figuration. This is art informel, Dubuffet and Fautrier, as distinguished by Yves Dubois. Between figuration and disfiguration, composition and decomposition, constructivism and deconstructivism, articulation and the inarticulate, there is always a directionality toward or away from either one. Think of these paradigms as embodied modes, or like an appendage, or a prosthesis, or a magic helmet or cape, the accoutrements of an actor. Topological poetics is a search for the sine qua non of a linguistic object, in this case. The thing that pushes to its limits, that push to its limits of what it is remains being what it is, or a thing that the search for the that the search for the thing that is preserved in an object under continuous deformation, such as stretching, twisting, crumpling, and bending, or copying and pasting, uh, is without closing holes, opening holes, tearing, gluing, or passing through itself. Let's see. Yeah. Okay, now I'm getting there. So, let's see. Yeah, okay. Well, starting in a subject-centered romantic mode, you can push toward the conceptual mode by borrowing basic computational or algorithmic methods of organization, but doing so in a way that is only quasi-procedural, ultimately deferring to the unsystematic whims of fancy or chance, or yeah. So I'm just trying to describe a lot of what I've done can be described as that. Like I use certain basic programmatic functions to reorganize things I've written combined with things that I've found. That doesn't really adhere to a pure conceptual mode of composition, or it's not, or that's a contradiction in terms. It's not a purely constructed piece, because I'm intervening according to the way I want it to be. But so I'm always, I feel like I'm working from a kind of a romantic mode toward a conceptual mode, and never really in the opposite, or purely conceptual, purely romantic mode, I suppose. And so, yeah, language to be looked at, things to be read. In a constructivist mode, impersonal procedures tend to magnify personal choices. Realism is a convention just like any other, no more, no less, and it is as laden with artifice as any other. I'm looking for a push and pull between errant mark and symbol system, the articulation and grammaleptic, as it is analogized in the conventions of visual art, especially between what is generally called outsider art, art brut, or naive art, and art that consciously, on the one hand, and on the other hand, art that consciously occupies a position relative to traditional categories of aesthetics, classical standards of beauty, from academic art, l'art de pompier, history painting, etc., to any convention that asserts itself in relative degrees of defiance to those categories, impressionism, dadaism, surrealism. So I'm looking for the boundaries that the designation of, at which the designation of outsider art is dissolving.
I mean, you're doing great. Don't worry about having to edit too much or go too fast.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't know, yeah, thank you. So I like to consider this horse picture is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. But to consider the ways in which naive art forms might not be so naive, not so unaware of their own clever use of techniques that can be traced back to their classical lineages. Between art brut, the art of the child, and academic arts that adhere to classical standards of rightness and proportion, Georges-Henri Luquet proposed that the art of the child can be understood as operating within a mode he termed intellectual realism. That is, rather than showing things as they are or as given, the child or the naive, unskilled artist shows things how they see them in their mind's eye, equating things how they are with how they ought to be. The converse is that a trained artist privileges what is known as perspectival realism, rendering things as they are, which in this context is the faithful rendering of form in an object in space as it appears, and accurately interpreting the way light and shadow behave on form in a specific lighting condition. Again, realism is one convention among many. So this idea of children's intellectual realism explains the transparency of objects. That when a kid draws a house, you can see into the rooms. Even if the walls are opaque, you can still see the furniture in the rooms because you know it's there, because the kid knows it's there. Same with toes through a shoe. There are many examples of outsider art that have use and manipulation of especially decorative and ornamental practices and principles of design. And some of what if it pops up by chance, I will point to it. But Bill Traylor's work makes incredible use of geometry and activating negative space in notan, which is just a Japanese principle of balance of light and dark. And there's great shape design, and they're largely geometrical, based off geometrical structures. So yeah, I've just been studying ornamental design a lot lately. That's why I made that connection. Because if you open any, I've downloaded a bunch of ornamental design books from like the 19th and 18th century, and any of the manifesto part at the beginning, like the first principles are always having a geometrical foundation for your design. You start with a square and you fill it in, or you start with a basic shape. So there's a lot of, I'm just pointing to the ways there's a lot of calculation in things that have been classified as totally naive. And same goes for these theories of children's art, that I just like this irony that there's something called intellectual realism to which a child might be adhering to, which sounds far from naive and very like technical and, you know, philosophical. So irony at the limits of irony pushes outward to a newly dialectical notion of authenticity, an irony that includes naivety. And I'm also trying to track the ways in which I'm sort of hinting at a broader claim about contemporary cultural needs, and the way I feel that irony has sort of taken over and interpolated every aspect of consumer production and consumption, and that we seem to be at a time where people do appreciate whatever is termed the authentic or the sincere, which is traditionally pitted against irony, but I'm trying to pose a different path that embraces irony and doesn't reject irony in order to get there. Basically, so making pathways out of barriers. Perhaps, and this is a thesis I'm willing to risk, that along these lines, that that perhaps is the case that children's art can only be what it is by being made by an adult. I'm just interested in problematizing innocence and experience in a William Blakean sense. And I see Jean Dubuffet's work I've just been thinking a lot about it and looking at it a lot, and I see it doing this. Um, and I think people in general, I think or art lovers were very like torn on this issue. So I'm an art handler. I went into this home uh, somewhere in New Haven where I packed up a bunch of folk art to be taken to the American Folk Art Museum. And it was all these handmade board games from as early as the mid 18th century. And they were exquisite. And just all these backgammon boards, chess boards, checkerboards, and but there were lots of things there that were interesting to me, and I made a comment because I've been really looking at Jean Dubuffet's work a lot, and I made a comment to the person whose all this art belonged to that I was interested in Jean Dubuffet, and he sort of made this snarky response. It seemed he said, "Yeah, he certainly knew what he was doing." And so I think there's this fetishization of not the naive art that goes on against what might be termed as this calculating approach to a kind of ironic naivete that I'm pointing to that I think is possible and equally as valid. Um, but yeah, so um, so I'm looking at two ways of understanding what it means to see things as they are, which incidentally is the ultimate task of Zen Buddhist monk becoming enlightened, is to see things clearly as they are, which we all know is impossible. Finding a complementarity between art group, children's art, naive art, and the style of writing known as the Nouveau Roman, just what I've been reading a lot of, just seeing things as they are is very much the MO of that style, along with conceptual writing, to register the facticity of raw information without worrying about supposed meanings. So I'll just end here with this last bit. This is a quote from uh, Alain Rabgrier's book of essays, where he says, but the world is neither significant nor absurd. It is quite simply, and that in any case is the most remarkable thing about it. And this recalls Wittgenstein's, a proposition from Wittgenstein's Tractatus that just says, it is not how things are in the world that is mystical, but that it exists. So yeah, that's all I have. Thank you.
All right, great, fantastic. I didn't know about your philosophical and lit crit background, but I'm sure that that's kind of, I kind of felt that. I kind of knew, again, the sort of calculated naivete. I kind of got a sense that you knew what you were doing, even though there was this sort of play with formulousness and sort of outsider art. So I think one of the things that I'll mention just to the students who are in the class right now is that when we talk about writing poetic statements and writing artist statements, a lot of people are fairly cynical about that practice in the art world that can be fairly banal. But I think this is a great example because to me, what it did for me as an appreciator of Colin's work is it solidified my intuition about his work, right? And so basically, there's a feedback loop that happens, right? So Colin's talking about his work and he sees it clearly enough. And he's also giving these examples of where it fits into the history of writing and other artists that he's interested in, that I'm able to confirm those intuitions and then thusly talk more about his work, or his work starts to enter into a discourse of talking about art, right, rather than just existing as an aesthetic object. And so I think this is and also I think Colin, I mean, you were a little bit nervous about doing something that's scripted like this, but I think it actually felt to me like a very creative intervention into the talk. And it very much, to me, is in the aesthetic of your Instagram, where there is no hierarchical relationship between the quote unquote explanatory text and the images, right? They sort of exist as two kind of things that are colliding. No one illuminating the other, but just part of the whole. So yeah, I really appreciate that. Do people feel like they have questions now? They want to wait, go on to the next person? What is the feeling of the room? Because I think also at one point we can have a conversation where, we're all talking about sort of both Henry and Colin can crosstalk as well. So should we go on and wait? Maybe next and all questions is once. I think that would be good, because then we'll have a whole milieu to enter into. All right. So Henry, are you ready?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I think Colin, you need to unshare screen,
Yeah.
and I'm not even sure. Yeah, there you go. All right, go for it.
First off, fantastic job, Colin. I very much enjoyed that. And thank you very much to Joe for inviting me here today. My name is Henry, and I run a YouTube channel called Dime Store Adventures. And what I want to do today is tell you a little bit about what I do, and then share with you 4 big lessons that I've learned in the past few years of making YouTube videos that hopefully might be useful to you in your own creative and academic endeavors. So if you've never seen my videos before, what I do, as Joe very eloquently explained, is piece together stories using old newspaper articles and magazine articles and history books and whatever else I can find, which means the vast majority of my videos just look like this for most of the runtime. It's just me monologuing into the camera and flashing a whole bunch of citations and clippings on the screen. I try to make videos based around landmarks a lot, because I think that's just a little more interesting to have some physical remnant of whatever 150-year-old story I'm talking about. And just because of the nature of human-made landmarks, that means I end up doing a lot of cemetery videos and gravestone videos, because headstones are, some of the most resilient physical things that humans make. It's tough to for a headstone to get in a scenario where somebody's going to want to knock it down, as in comparison to like a building or something like that. And then just to really hammer home what my videos are like, I got a little 2.5-minute intro to one of my videos that I'm going to play, and then we'll move on from there.
Way back in 1897, there used to be a sign sitting right about here that said, "This is not the grave of the dictionary man." Why? Well, believe it or not, it's for the exact same reason that Congress had to build a new grave monument for Thomas Jefferson back in 1883. And it's for the same reason that John Brown's gravestone used to be protected by a box and padlock in 1894. And it's for the exact same reason that the state of Kentucky had to build an iron cage around Daniel Boone's headstone back in 1896. All of these things and more were done because of the relic hunters, the scourge of 19th century historians. See, nowadays, if someone calls themselves a relic hunter, then they're probably doing something relatively innocent, like walking around an old battlefield with a metal detector. But in Victorian era America, that term meant something very, very different. Back then, a relic hunter was somebody who traveled all around the country with a hammer and chisel, knocking chunks of stone out of grave monuments, famous rocks, and whatever else they can get their hands on. These people collected little pieces of famous items as trophies or souvenirs. And this headstone right here is a perfect example of their handiwork. See how little pieces of the headstone have been chipped off along the top there? You can thank the relic hunters for that. This is the headstone of Noah Webster, a farmer who, with all due respect, lived pretty much an unremarkable life here in West Hartford, Connecticut before passing away in 1813. So, you're probably wondering, why were the relic hunters so interested in this stone if Webster wasn't even famous? Well, it's because they were confusing this guy with the Noah Webster that started Webster's Dictionary. Yeah, so that's why the cemetery put up that sign and why the local newspapers ran stories telling people to quit coming in here and busting up the stone. But hey, all things considered, this little headstone is still in decent condition, right? Like, the relic hunters never got the chance to really bash it up too bad. So how about I show you a gravestone that really got put through the ringer?
Yeah, so that's kind of the gist of it. Basically, every video I make follows that template in some way. And before I get into my big lessons, I just want to answer the 2 questions that I get asked the most through comments and emails and stuff like that. The first of which is, what online resources do I use for research? Because I do probably, I'd say 80–90% of my research online. The other last 10 or 20% is done in like libraries, historical societies, and things like that. But almost always the genesis of my video topics starts with online resources. So here's a few of my favorite websites. Some of these are free. Some of them cost money. If you're brand new to looking through online archives, I would absolutely suggest starting with that top link there. That's the Library of Congress's archive site. They got old newspapers, magazines, books, images from postcards, like they got everything. So, and it's all totally free, huge archive, very easy to use, user interface and everything. It's a treasure trove in there, highly recommend. And then also, I've also found in making my videos that for pretty much any topic that you can think of, there's somebody out there who's super into it and is running an extremely niche archive site on that topic. So like a couple times I've made videos that heavily involve the spiritualist movement in the late 1800s in the United States. And as I was doing research for those videos, I found this website ran by just one person who has archived literally hundreds of issues of old like spiritualist magazines and literature that just ended up being incredibly valuable for my video. So I always recommend poking around a little bit to see if you can find somebody out there who just knows everything and has all sorts of information on whatever topic you're looking into. And then the other big question I get asked is, how do I find video topics? And when I first started, I got a lot of my video topics from websites that sort of catalog strange landmarks. So like Atlas Obscura, Waymarking, Historical Marker Database, HDM or HMDB for short. If you just want to see what kind of cool stuff is in your area, those sites are great. But after a little while, I eventually exhausted all the stuff around me that was cataloged on those websites. And so nowadays, I get almost all of my video topics just through the brute force method of just sitting down and reading some old history book from 1880 or whatever. And my favorite thing to do is to just pick a random week from a random newspaper. Like I might pick the Brooklyn, Connecticut Daily Eagle, and then I'll just read the entire week from like May 1st to May 7th, 1884, right? And just as an example of the kind of or just how easy it is to find really interesting stuff doing this. Just yesterday, I was reading through an old newspaper from Indiana from 1920 something, I don't remember. And there was some article in there talking about the White House. And I noticed that they used the phrase White House Mansion, that 3-word phrase, the White House Mansion, which I don't know about you, but I never hear that anymore. People just say Joe Biden lives in the White House, right? Not White House Mansion. And so that kind of piqued my curiosity a bit. and I went over to a big stack of postcards that I have, because I run a postcard club where I send people old postcards through the mail. And I pulled out my Washington, D.C. stack and pulled out a bunch of cards of the White House. And lo and behold, a whole bunch of those White House cards from the 20s and 30s all use the specific phrase White House mansion, right? And so right there, I could have a video topic like, when did this phrase start to die out? Was there like a big moment where it fell out of favor? Like, what's the history of that phrase, and why don't people say it anymore? What kind of, cultural gleanings can you come up with from that? And I would just say, I would highly recommend, if you are just looking for some kind of inspiration, or you just got some time to kill, pop open that Library of Congress website, pick a random newspaper and read, because you'll just be shocked at how easy it is to find interesting stuff. It feels like every page there's something, even if it's not some big giant story, just a little interesting tidbit like that White House mansion thing, something about how people used to talk that is totally alien to how we talk today. But anyway, now it's time to move on to my 4 big lessons. But before I do, I got a warning for you, which is that I'm a YouTuber. I wanted to say this because when I first got started as a YouTuber, I used to watch and read a whole bunch of articles on how to have success as a YouTuber. And as I got more into it, I realized that a lot of that advice was just absolutely terrible, because it was coming from somebody who runs a YouTube channel that's totally different from mine, totally different aims, totally different topics, totally different workflow, totally different everything. So their advice wasn't applicable at all to me. And so I just want to warn everybody, everything that I do is done through the lens of me being a YouTuber. Everything I make is either for YouTube or Patreon. So don't take what I'm about to tell you as just this universal applicable advice. It's just stuff that worked for me that might make sense to you. With that said, my first lesson: you do not have to accept existing narrative framework. This was a big one for me, because when I first got started, almost always my workflow would be, I would be reading through some book, like maybe I'm looking at the history of Norton, Massachusetts from 1887, and there's some little paragraph in there about a headstone in Norton with an odd inscription. And I think, oh, there might be a story there. So I pop onto the newspaper archives and I start looking around, and after a while I find an old newspaper with a big quarter-page article on that headstone. It's got a whole story there and everything. It's written like a story. It's got all this information. And when I first started, I would just sort of accept that, it'd be like, I found the story, here it is. And inevitably, my version of that story would follow the same framework. And of course, I'd jump in with anecdotes from other sources, and I'd, maybe piece together some other little bits of information that original journalist wasn't privy to. But at its core, I would follow their framework. And after a while, I just kind of realized that I don't have to do that. I can maybe in my version of the story, this guy isn't the main character. It's actually this woman who is a side character in the journalist's version. And maybe the journalist felt that this event was the climax of the story. This is the most important event. But for me, maybe that's not my climax. Maybe this other part later on is the climax. And so long story short, I would always recommend taking whatever story you can find, break it down into building blocks of information, and then build it back up yourself. You almost always, or at least for me, I almost always come away with something that feels more like me and feels a little bit more cohesive to how I want to tell the story, rather than just parroting how somebody else told it. I would just sort of unconsciously accept that because this person was a contemporary to this story, they know best how to tell it. But that's not always the case. Always come into it with a critical eye, I would say. Another lesson: sometimes the research itself is the most interesting part. I learned this one with a specific video that I made, because I would get questions all the time with people asking me how I do research. And so I made a video once where I just sort of outlined my process and talked about how I find information, how I find landmarks, things like that. And I uploaded that video, and it pretty much immediately became the most popular thing I ever made at that moment, just like that. that. And in that moment, I kind of realized that people like that sort of inside baseball stuff, right? It sort of makes you a part of the story, and you as the researcher a part of the story, and how you found stuff becomes interesting, right? Like a good example for this one. A while ago, I made a video about a headstone that I found in Brooklyn, Connecticut. And I'm going to paraphrase, but the inscription on the headstone basically said, "Here lies Jonathan Richardson, who never believed in God and never believed that Jonah swallowed the whale." And those of you that are familiar with the Bible story, it's the whale swallowed Jonah, right? That's the Bible story. A whale swallowed Jonah. So my question for the video was, why does this inscription say never believed that Jonah swallowed the whale? And in the course of my research, I figured out that it's actually this very old saying that's completely fallen out of favor today. It started in the early 1800s with people saying a sentiment that was along the lines of, "I believe everything in the Bible. I believe in the Garden of Eden, and I believe that the whale swallowed Jonah, and I would believe, if the Bible told me to, that Jonah swallowed the whale." And over time, in the decades ensuing after that, that phrase just got shortened and shortened, and eventually people were just saying, "I believe that Jonah swallowed the whale," as shorthand for, "I believe the Bible so much that if it told me Jonah swallowed the whale, I would accept it," which is pretty interesting in itself. But in my opinion, the real interesting part of the video was that I pieced that together by reading old sermons from pastors, right? Because nobody at the time just wrote down, "This is what Jonah swallowed the whale" means, right? So I had to sort of piece it together using context clues, what they meant. And in my opinion, that ended up being a whole lot more interesting than just the conclusion of the video on its own. Now, moving on, number 3, wrong information is not necessarily useless information. Legend and rumor is sometimes just as important as factual information, and just as interesting too.
Yeah, we show them. What's my basket, bro?
There's somebody talking. Okay, I think we're good. Good example for this one of my most popular videos. One time somebody left me a comment asking me to investigate a legend from their hometown, where there was this big headstone, as you can see here, for a guy named Lauren Bosworth. And the legend that the guy who left the comment told me that he had heard growing up was that this guy, Lauren Bosworth, hated his family so much that in his will, he specifically wrote that all his money, every cent, was going to be used for building a giant headstone. So that way, none of his family could inherit any of it. And I looked into the story and I found out that that's not true. The real... I'm still... whatever. The real story is that... the guy wrote in his will that he wanted 1/6 of his estate to be spent on a headstone, and he owned a whole bunch of land and property and everything, so we didn't really realize how much money 1/6 of his estate really was, and that's why the headstone was so gigantic. And so I made that video and I thought that was the end of it, right? But then about 9 months later, I started looking into another headstone for a guy named Lucas Douglas. And the story I heard on this one was that this guy, Lucas Douglas, didn't have a home. He was just like a wandering traveler. And one day he died, and it turned out that he had a secret bank account with thousands of dollars in it. And so the city used that secret bank account to build him this giant headstone. And I looked into it, and I found out that the real story was that this guy hated his family so much that he put in his will that he wanted all of his money spent on a giant headstone. And he even specifically wrote down that his family members were going to get like $1, $2, $3, so that they couldn't contest the will and say that he had accidentally left them out or whatever. And so the conclusion from these two videos is that over time, the story from the Lucas Douglas monument of the guy hating his family migrated over to the Lauren Bosworth monument, which to me is 10 times more interesting than the actual factual stories themselves. You know, it's super interesting to me that a story somehow moved 8 miles to the east, right? And people just accepted it for decades and decades. And over time, it basically just became fact because people said it so much. And my last lesson, and this is a big one, the most important thing for my own videos, I think, talk to other humans. When possible, use internet research as a launching pad to talk to other human beings. This has been absolutely pivotal. Pretty much every single one of my favorite moments in my own videos is because I picked up the phone or I sent an email or I just started talking to random people I saw in whatever town I was in. And I got a few examples to show you both how powerful this can be and also how easy it can be too. Because it's intimidating for sure to just like cold call people, but oftentimes I've found that people are really interested in helping you if you come to them with something cool about some object that they have or some story that they've heard or whatever. So here's a few examples. So this first one is from a video I made about an island called Block Island, which is about 5 miles south off the coast of Rhode Island. And the genesis for this video is I was reading through an old book of folklore from the 1930s. And in that book, there was a whole paragraph about how Block Island had a population of wreckers, and what the wreckers did was wait for ships to crash onto the shore of Block Island, and then they would come swarming down off the cliffs and steal everything off the ship, and then run back up onto Block Island away with their booty that they'd stolen off the ship, right? And so I went out to the island thinking that this was probably just legend, right? And I was thinking there's no way that I'm going to find any hard evidence that this ever happened, blah, blah, blah. It's just stories. It's just like the same thing with the monuments that I was just talking about. But then as I was on the ferry out to Block Island, I just started talking to this guy on the ferry, and I asked him if he'd heard of the Block Island wreckers, expecting him to say no. And what he said was, "Oh yeah, I've heard of the wreckers, and in fact, I am a wrecker," which totally shocked me. And he went on to tell me about a certain thing that was currently on the shore of the island, and he told me where to go to find it. And because of that conversation, I got to include this at the end of my video.
All right, here we go. Brett told me that the thing we're looking for here is supposedly right on the beach. It should be very easy to spot. Let's see. There it is. Oh man. Do you see that? That's exactly what Brett told me was going to be here. A genuine Block Island wreck. Holy cow. That looks so good. I'm running. I can't wait. Oh my God. Literally never would have found this if it wasn't for Brett telling me about it. That just goes to show you that no matter how much you research, nothing beats just talking to people. Yes.
So, according to Brett, this is what he told me, is that boat was owned by some rich German guy, and he crashed the boat on the shore of the island and just decided to abandon it. And he just jumped on a plane and flew back to Germany. And again, according to Brett, as soon as he did, a whole bunch of Block Islanders came pouring down onto the shore and ransacked the boat and took a whole bunch of stuff off of it. And so I got to include that real life contemporary story of Block Island wreckers in the video because I just talked to a guy on the boat. That was all it took, right? I just talked to a guy on the boat and got to include this in the video. Another good example is from this video. This is one of my longest videos. Basically what it is a sort of analysis and cataloging of a certain like quirk that the American media picked up after the Jack the Ripper murders in the late 1800s. Because after Jack the Ripper, American journalists got super into calling just any criminal Jack the whatever. So like if somebody robbed a bank, they became Jack the Robber. And if somebody like got fined for spitting on the sidewalk, then the newspaper was going to write a whole column about how Jack the Spitter has come to town and here he is. And they just got so absurd with this naming convention, just calling any criminal Jack the whatever. And so in the course of doing research for this video, I found out about a guy that the media had named Jack the Smasher, and his MO was that he would throw rocks through big plate glass windows in storefronts in the middle of the night, right? And he did that multiple times. And so this whole series of articles I found of how Jack the Smasher was haunting the streets and all that sort of stuff, right? But in the course of the research, I also found a kind of offhand mention that Jack the Smasher was also a very accomplished soapstone artist. And the reason that he developed this affinity for smashing windows is that he fell off some scaffolding and hit his head while he was doing a soapstone project. And what's more, when he was in prison for his smashing episodes, he he made some little soapstone sculptures and gave them to the jailers in the prison. And I found mention that maybe some of those sculptures might still be in the hands of a certain museum in the same town as the jail today. So I just sent an email to the museum, and because of that, I got to put this in my video.
Eventually, one of these carvings kind of made its way into the hands of a local Bloomington mother who ultimately decided that the piece really deserved to be preserved in a museum. So she donated it to her local historical society in April of 1924, and now, exactly 100 years later, I am very proud to present to you a John Leone original soap carving, created with nothing more than a block of soap, a pin, and Leone's thumbnail.
Again, the reason that I got to include that in the video is because I just sent an email to the museum. That was all it took, and I got this fantastic little conclusion to my big giant video just from sending an email. And my last example doesn't require an introduction because I basically explained it all in the video. So here you go. We're going back to the relic hunters again.
This is the shore of the Seekonk River in Providence. Hundreds of years ago, there used to be a big boulder right here called Slate Rock that the founder of Providence supposedly landed on when he first came to Rhode Island. As you can see, it is totally gone nowadays, in part because relic hunters tore it to pieces. A while ago, when I investigated this story, I was actually able to dig up some old Freemasonry magazines that mentioned that a local Freemason chapter was going to cut out several feet of the rock to use as a pedestal. So I made a few phone calls, I asked around, I did some driving, I looked into it, and wouldn't you know it, I was actually able to track down one of the pedestals 150 years later. This is the main hall of the Rhode Island Grand Lodge of Freemasons. And this is a big hunk of slate rock that was relic hunted and turned into a pedestal a century and a half ago. Pretty crazy to actually see this thing in 2023. So hey, that's about it for this video.
Yeah, and so I got to include that in the video because I read in those Freemasonry magazines, like I said, and I just went on the website of the Grand Lodge of Rhode Island Freemasons and found a phone number for the Grand Lodge and just completely cold called them. And that was what led to me getting to put that pedestal in the video. I just totally cold called him out of the blue. And the guy that I talked to couldn't be more excited for me to come in and show me his little bits of historical artifacts, you know? So in conclusion, whenever you can, whenever you got the chance or ability, go out of your way to email people, call people, talk to people, because you can get some really, really fantastic results. And that's about all I got to say. Thanks for listening.
All right, some amazing stuff there. Why don't we soldier forward with sort of questions or comments, and then maybe also sort of Henry can, you know, if you have any question for Colin or vice versa. But I would say the question that I would want to start with that maybe can link both of you together is that Henry said something, no, sorry, Colin said something at one point, base material resist integration into the symbolic order. And this is something that actually, when we get into the Gothic, we do talk about. It's a kind of formulation that percolates up through linguistics and into psychoanalysis, right? This relationship between the symbolic and the base material. Again, how do you, as an artist, but also as a being with a psychology, enter into the symbolic, right? And I would say that there's certain points, I think both of you are kind of alluding to this, whether it's through narrative or typical form, where we have our experience of life, we have our experience of materials, and we kind of try to fit it into the symbolic. We try to fit it into the forms that are given to us, and it doesn't work, right? And then I think that both of you are finding ways to sort of reorganize what you think about form to include those things that make you excited, right? Those enthusiasms. And so, you know, in terms of what Henry is doing, for example, and again, this connects back to some of the things that you were saying, Colin, there are a lot of people who are literary artists who encounter these types of the material of the news, right? The material of the everyday in the news. And they're sort of like, well, this is fascinating. I love this. I don't know where to put it, right? And so there's like, you know, Fénéon, Félix Fénéon, the anarchist, 19th century anarchist, who would write what he called novels in 3 lines, where we just take like little, you know, little oddities from newspapers, and he would make them into almost haikus, as if to say, that's it, right? No story, right? It's just the way in which he would frame each of these little bits would be his novels in 3 lines. Colin, you mentioned Williams a lot. Williams, of course, would, you know, instead of, you know, what he would do is he kind of was so important for documentary poetics, because he would just take those newspaper articles, take that stuff from archives, and he would just plant it in the middle of his poems, right? No explanation, no voiceover narrative, right? No sort of like, this is the moral of the story. He would just put it here. Same for like Charles Reznikoff. Charles Reznikoff was also somebody who's very important in terms of going back and you would go into like court cases. And that would be the purely conceptual way to approach it, right? Where you're just like presenting the court case as is, as a sort of reflection of the American psyche in a way. So I guess, you know, maybe just to open up the question is to sort of like how to extend this notion of how you think about form in relationship to, you know, whatever impulse, the creative impulse that carries you through the everyday. Because both of you, and again, just to sort of like make it clear what I'm getting at, is I think that the internet specifically encourages that sense of art that is continually in process. It's not like you're working on one big video or one big poem piece, but you have to somehow find a way to have it constantly engage your enthusiasms. And I think that you kind of have to leave typical form at the door with that, because you need to be improvising, you need to be figuring out what works best from your, center of gravity.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
I like this question, or the way you've put that. I would say, I think, well, one thing I really admire about Henry, your work is, and can relate to some degree, is this kind of archive fever, this obsessive research you do. I definitely do that as well. I'm constantly downloading books, old magazines and things, and looking through things, screenshotting and manipulating things I find. And it's really just this continuous, seems like this continuous stream of data and visual information that I'm processing, and it doesn't always come to anything, or like I'm not really always able to put it into a form or create a product from the things I consume. But I like that you've leaned into the kind of arbitrary chance-based findings, discoveries, and like piecing together a product from that. I could really take a page out of your book on that. That's really cool.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And you're absolutely right that it's I'm sure you can empathize with this. One of the hardest feelings in the world is finding something that's super interesting on its own, like just separated from yourself. It's super duper interesting, but you just cannot find a way to build it into something like a larger work, right? And it just doesn't feel right to just present it by itself, and you feel the need to attach like a little bit of yourself to it, but you just can't find the way to do it. And so it just ends up sitting in as a link on like a Google Doc or something like that for years and years and years, just wasting away there.
The compulsive collection of material, just constantly building up. Sometimes it'll materialize into something, but Joe, you're pointing out ways in which artists do present things as is, and that is the art, which is another way to go about it. But I do like, this is kind of what I was getting at, is this push and pull between the personal and the conceptual, and how to manage that. And I think ideally the project would present itself in a way that it would be clear which direction to take on that. Like, you have a personal avenue to add to it, or does it stand alone, and is it powerful enough or meaningful enough to present by itself?
Can you maybe explain, Colin, a little bit more? So, and I think this goes back to your notion of the romantic to conceptual.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure everybody, I mean, I kind of get what you're saying, but maybe if you could explain that a little bit more, because I think that's a very interesting part of what you're talking about.
Yeah. So I think it's a sort of reductive binary that you can use to understand different modes of composition, or as I phrase it, composition versus construction, where so in a traditional romantic mode of composing poetry, it will like inspiration strikes a subject, and you do your best to express your feelings and ideas on a subject, and so I mean that's just one like way to understand that. But then I mean in the late, I guess, I mean from really the 60s onward, there was the conceptualist turn, I guess, and writing took a lot of cues from the visual world or arts world, where there would be well, I'm really referring to, I was rereading the introduction to this book called Against Expression by Craig Dworkin and Kenneth Cope, where it's a volume they edited of a bunch of examples of what they consider to be conceptual poetry or conceptual writing, which are these essentially these pieces of texts that have, I mean, to try to my best to explain what it is, that have a rule that they follow explicitly, that then that the work itself is the product of that procedure having been executed properly. So the question, I guess, about conceptual art or writing is that not could it have been done better, but could it have been done differently at all? Like it's not, you don't really add anything to it yourself because the rules are already predetermined. So it's just the result, like an algorithm or a procedure. So there's very little self or inspiration, seemingly, supposedly. I mean, this is why it's interesting to look for those ways in which the self or the personal appears in these things that present themselves as purely procedural or objective. So yeah, I guess that'd be my best stab at that explanation.
Nice, nice. Anybody else have any questions or thoughts? Yeah, Damien.
This is a question for Colin. So I was browsing your Instagram page, and I love the way that you make use of your carousel format for your images, and your captions can vary from one poetic line to something that feels kind of freeform journal entry-esque. And I was just curious, like when you start creating these experiences, or I know sometimes you also have music involved. When you start putting these posts and these kind of poetic experiences together, is there a specific place you start? Like, do the images you plan to curate kind of inform what you want the captions to be? Or does the poetry come first, or do they kind of like, is it like a kind of interwoven process? So I was curious about the steps that you take to kind of bring those things together.
Oh, cool. Yeah, thanks. That's a cool question. I think it's changed a lot. It's constantly changing. I think it used to be very much like I just had a buildup of images I wanted to share, and then I would also very separately have things I had written that I also wanted to share, and there wouldn't necessarily be a relationship between the two, but I've become more and more interested in a kind of like naive, I guess, confessional mode that does very much include the images as part of the writing, or the writing is explicitly responding to the images. I've been trying to do, just playing with that a little bit more. It's kind of funny that seems so like foundational for what Instagram is, but I'm only just now like really doing that. But yeah, thanks.
Any other thoughts? Yeah, Henry.
Colin. Like what you were saying about the arbitrary line of where outsider art begins, because I feel like I've just sort of always accepted that label when people throw it around, you know, and not really thought too hard about that. And I'm curious if, because you also mentioned folk art, I'm curious if you think the line between folk art and outsider art is equally as arbitrary.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's yeah, equally porous boundary for sure. But I think folk art, I mean, I don't really know folk art as well for some reason. I think maybe folk art is like somewhat more sanctioned by an official like establishment. I think maybe for some reason folk art. To me, this is just kind of conjecture, but it seems like folk art is more, at least or historically, has been more so an acceptable label of art, or it brings the art closer to an acceptable stage, or more legitimate. But I think more and more now, art brut or outsider art is kind of becoming more and more in that zone, similarly accepted by the establishment, or is very much more similar to folk art. I'm really not sure. That's a great question, though. Yeah.
Leanne, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask this kind of to both of you. Kind of like what's your process or like ritual if you're having like writer's block, or like with Henry, I don't know, I've never talked to a YouTuber before. So like what do you ever get like creative blocks? Because it seems like there's just so much like history and so many things you could go explore. So yeah, just kind of like what's your like rituals for that, and like I don't know, what makes you feel better? I don't know.
Fantastic question. I do get a form of writer's block all the time, but for me, most commonly, it comes in the form of like a choice paralysis, where I have like 5 different things that I want to do, and then I just sit there for like an entire day working, getting each project like 1% done because I can't just pick one to stick onto, you know? And typically, this is kind of silly, but one of the ways that best gets me out of that funk is to literally use a random number generator and just pick a project. And then I'm like, that's the one. I'm sticking on that. I have to abide by the random number 2 that I just pulled out of this number generator, you know? And then also sometimes when I get a more traditional sense of writer's block where I just can't figure out at all what I want to do next, the easiest thing for me to do is, like I said, just to start reading something, look through a newspaper again, and try to find something that just spurs my brain a little bit, you know?
Yeah. I mean, if I were to add,
Go ahead.
yeah, I totally relate to that choice paralysis. But for me, I typically, well, I do a lot of different things. I make music as well. But I think for me, it's like, sorry, more so about which activity I want to like commit myself to, or and so I end up just embracing the chance methods that I use to compose a lot of the time. I'll just put shit together and decide it's finished, or and then I'll just embrace that aspect of it. So I kind of getting over a perfectionist tendency. Yeah. So.
I have a question for Henry, and I actually was imagining when you were saying, here are the questions that people always ask me, I thought that this question was going to be there, and it wasn't. So, you know, one of the things, and maybe I think you have to be somebody who makes a lot of media to be aware of this. But one of the things that's very impressive about your work is the sense of naturalness and improvisation. But we know that when you're making a video, you need to deal with, like, you know, for example, just the audio, like in terms of having good miking. And I you know, I remember the one where you're playing in the snow and talking about the flags, right? You know, how do you mic this while still being able to do that performance? And sometimes when you're watching videos, you'll go on seemingly without an edit for quite a long time. I mean, there's obviously times when you sort of, you know, screw up. Or I remember one video you were watching where like maybe some bad weather started to happen, and then you had to sort of like make a point of stopping it and sort of, you know, continuing it in another place and time or something like that, right? There's always those moments. But I think that, you know, so like I guess the question is like, how do you create that technical environment? And I'm assuming most of the time you're doing this alone. So you're creating it in technical, you're not having people with booms and boom mics, or, you know, you're not having somebody, you know, hold the camera, right? So you're doing something that's alone. it's technically well recorded, but you're still maintaining that sense of looseness and improvisation. How do you do that?
That's a great question. And I think the sort of like umbrella answer to that is that I try very hard to have that sort of vibe, you know, like I'm very much performing when I'm making my videos and inhabiting a sort of character of a narrator who's really excited about whatever I'm talking about, you know, and like most of my videos are like 90% scripted out to the word. And I literally bring a binder and a folding chair and I put the camera on the folding chair and then put the binder behind it with a script in it. And most of the time when I'm cutting in my videos, it's not because I messed up, it's because I have to go turn the page in my script. And I do all of that so that it sounds natural, like I'm just talking off the cuff, you know? And I think the biggest reason that I'm able to make it sound at least somewhat natural is number one, just practice. If you go watch my first couple years worth of videos, they don't sound natural at all, I can promise you. And then the second biggest thing is when I'm writing scripts, I sort of try to write as if I was talking off the cuff and just put edits where I need to edit so that it doesn't sound like I'm talking nonsense, you know? Like when I'm writing scripts, I usually talk outside, and if I say a connecting word like yeah or anyways or something like that, I'll write it into the script. So that way when I'm reading it later, it comes out as if I was just talking naturally, because when I said it in my room a few days ago as I was writing the script, I said so now that I'm talking it out loud, I also say in the moment, you know.
With the binder, like how big is this font? Because it's not, you're kind of a distance away, so I'm just like, man, how can you got binoculars that you're looking through? Like that seems wild to me.
Wow.
That's
Okay.
it.
Wow, you got good eyes then.
Nice.
Well, I use a GoPro, and GoPros have like even when you set it on the linear camera setting, they kind of have a vague fisheye, so it usually seems like I'm a lot further away from the camera than I really am.
Mm-hmm.
Usually I'm
And
like
then,
maybe 8 feet away, something like that.
okay. And then brass tacks in terms of like microphones, are you using wireless? Are you using shotgun microphones? Is it because a GoPro doesn't have a great mic, right?
Well, it's funny you asked that. I only in the past like year and a half switched to using a lapel mic. For the first like maybe 2 or 3 years, I just screamed at the GoPro from like 10 feet away.
Nice. Any other questions? Marlene?
One connecting thought came to mind as I listened to both of you, um, was about contextualization. And my own background is in translation, which was very much guided by Mikhail Bakhtin's notion that words in and of themselves don't have a meaning outside of context and how people decide to use them, that agreement in any situation. And so when you were talking about what words used to mean historically versus how that changes over time, that was very interesting to me. But as a feature that we're usually not aware of, but that we're still swimming in, and how that relates to what Colin's work is, where it seems like to me, and I don't know if I'm understanding clearly, but the contextualization and asking questions about what is that context, and it made me wonder how much deconstructionism or Derrida informs your work also. So that's kind of a split question to either one of you.
Well, I'll just start off by saying Derrida is probably my favorite writer. So yeah, very much so. Yeah, it's a huge part of how I think. I can't get away from it. It's almost like a curse in some ways. But yeah, absolutely, for sure. That's very true.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, I think so much of my video, so many of the topics that I talk about are interesting entirely because of how words have changed over time and been recontextualized. You know, like there's a lot of things, like with that gravestone I was talking about, it's just a gravestone on itself. And when it was first put up, it was kind of interesting because this guy in 1870 was openly professing himself to be an atheist. But really, it's taken on a whole new meaning because this term that was totally innocuous at the time that it was carved onto the headstone, and 95% of people that walked by would have totally understand what the guy meant, and now it's just completely impenetrable to a modern set of eyes, right?
Catherine has an interesting question, and I think I actually know the answer myself because I went through Henry's went back and reviewed his whole trajectory and actually saw this in process. But so the question is, when starting your channel, how did you decide on form, style, and content for consistency? Did you plan it all out, or did it evolve over time?
Absolutely evolved over time. My first few videos are one of my first few videos is me trying to cross a state park without touching the ground by playing floor is lava and jumping across the state park. That was what I was doing when I first started. And over time, I just started getting more and more involved with history and landmarks, and both naturally at the same time. Those are the videos that got the most attention and the ones that I had the most fun making. So just overall, it sort of evolved that that was what I wanted to spend most of my time doing.
Anybody else? I mean, we're about the time when it's a good break for our midpoint dinner. Any other burning questions? All right, well, we'll leave it at that. I mean, thank you very much, Colin and Henry, for being so gracious, and I feel like we learned a lot, and hopefully that everybody here in the room can take this inspiration into their work. And yeah, I think there's some thank yous in the chat. So yeah, let's give a sort of hand. And I'll probably follow up, Colin and Henry, with you in email the next couple of days, and about the video recording and posting or sharing that with you, however we did that. Yeah, so happy Halloween. And for those of you in the class, again, we'll come back at around 11. Oh no, I'm on East Coast time right now. So it's what time is it? What time is it where you are?
It's
Come back at 8.
7:04.
Okay, so come back around 8:05, and yeah, so we'll see you on the other side. Thank you very much, Henry and Colin.
All right, thank you all.
See you.
Thank you all. And if anybody has any questions or anything that they want to ask, feel free to email me too. I'd be happy to talk further about anything. Thanks so much.
Cool. Thank you.